Welcome to the latest edition of the Dynamic Political Centrism podcast, hosted by Alan Steinberg, produced by Dr. Yonatan Yaris the Doc. This week's special guest, Brent Johnson, political reporter for NJ.com and the Star Ledger.
Good evening and welcome to the Dynamic Political Centrism podcast. I am Alan Steinberg, the voice of Dynamic Political Centrism, and we have a show of three major topics tonight. One topic is 9/11 memories. The second topic is the gubernatorial race, which really is heating up. And the third is the shock and the impact of the assassination of Charlie Kirk. With us, as always, is our producer, Dr. Yonatan Yaris. We call him Doc. And the man who I think is the finest young journalist to cover New Jersey elections for many years, and that is Brent Johnson. And in a very short period of time, he and Charlie Stow are basically the two leading lights covering elections, the gubernatorial races in New Jersey. So, Brent, we're delighted to have you here as always. And I also feel when I'm here with Brent, I have company as a fellow Mets fan. So
yes, I'm wearing. Although they're now losing 6-4 in the seventh against the Phillies. So
I got to tell you something. I'm going to need a straitjacket by the time the season is over.
This is so awkward as the Phillies fan being outnumbered. This is not a good night.
Oh yeah, no, you're in a minority here.
It is a weird Mets season. I can't get a grip on this team.
Well, I don't have a grip as to what is going to happen in postseason. I will say this. I had a great basis of comparison the other night. I went to a Yankees game, and I posted on Facebook a picture of myself with my Met hat on, wearing orange and blue, the Met colors, at Yankee Stadium. And I thought it took a lot of guts for me to do that. I was proud of that. But I got to say, a Met game is a joyous communal experience, even when they lose. Whereas going to a Yankee game was like rooting for U.S. Steel. And it gave me a good basis for comparison in the future. With that, I'm sorry, Brett, you were going to say?
The Yankee Stadium is like going to a giant dentist's office. It just feels, it's like an antiseptic.
That is exactly what it is. However, you do feel the history there because they have pictures.
You can't deny that.
It's the ivory tower of baseball.
Yes.
It is the ivory tower, but it is what they call, as a matter of fact, a cathedral ballpark.
Yeah.
And that's really what it is. With that said, let's go to our first topic tonight. Very solemn topic. Today was the 24th anniversary of September 11, 2001. A lot of reflection. All of us have had friends who passed away in the horrors of 9/11, 2001. It was a time for reflection, a time of memory, and also a time to reflect on the future. And all of us have been doing that since 9/11. I wrote a column today, my Substack column, and I basically decided to rerun a column that I had written on the 10th anniversary. My father had passed away a few weeks before 9/11, the 10th anniversary, September 11, 2011. And so my column reflected on, the fact that my father passed away, but also my hero of 9/11. My hero of 9/11 was Lou Eisenberg, who was the chair of the Port Authority, who almost single-handedly was a unifying factor in keeping, really saving the Port Authority. There were records to be preserved. He went to more funerals during that time. It was a time of real trauma for him and his assistant, who had been my assistant when I was the head of the Meadowlands Commission, Cosmo Servideo. But I was, oddly enough, I was in Israel on 9/11, 2001. I was with the Metro West Federation, and we went on a mission of comfort to comfort Israelis who had suffered from terrorism. And when 9/11 happened, they ended up comforting us. So I'm never going to forget that. I'd like to hear, first of all, from Doc, who was living at South Jersey, and then from Brent as to what their 9/11 memories were.
So I was in 8th grade, but it's actually been interesting now being an educator and teaching about it today to my students, actually. And now that they have a little bit comparison now for the first time in a way, because they went through COVID in terms of a life action of things stopping. So I was in eighth grade. I was at Rosa Middle School in Cherry Hill. And a student came in saying that something happened in New York, but the source wasn't really the best source. It was kind of a student who was a jokester, like. But then they all called us back into our equivalent of homeroom, which we called advisory. We basically stayed in there the whole rest of the day. I remember coming home and being glued to the TV with my brother, who was a junior at that point. I didn't really learn more about the impact until I got older and really got to Rutgers at that point, where I started having friends whose mom had passed away in the towers, and like it was a little bit of sheltering. I did have a couple of stories of dodges of people who were from Cherry Hill, who was probably the furthest point south for commuting to New York. One either lost a job or didn't end up going in that day and would have been above the point of impact, where there were no one who survived above that. So even just that, it was just shaking. And even looking up, I always remember the silence of the skies. Because especially being in Cherry Hill, we're right across from Philadelphia International Airport, and that is always having action and having silence. It was very eerie during COVID to hear that same silence again.
Yep,
And
that's a very good analogy you made.
that was very jarring to hear that again, and almost brought back a traumatic response. But two very different incidences of the world shutting down.
I was before I get to Brent, I was in Jerusalem, and I was fearful that I would never get home because they cut off all air travel from Israel to the United States, and I would walk the streets at night. I'd go out for a walk. I just had to get out of the hotel, and it was eerie. But what about you, Brent?
I was a senior in high school at East Brunswick High School in Middlesex County, and we are the very center of the state, and a lot of families have people that work, would live in East Brunswick and get on the turnpike and either take the bus in or drive in or take the train in. So we had 9 families lose. Nine of my friends and classmates lost parents. And I remember that day I was in film appreciation class, and they turned we were watching a movie, and then you back in the old days when you turn off a VHS, it would go to you'd see the television come back on, and on the first plane had only hit at that point. And I remember thinking like, well, someone flew a plane into the Trade Center. And by the time I got to gym class, which was the next period, they made an announcement that another plane had hit. And please, if your parents work in the trade towers, please come down to the main office. And I remember just, it was weird and eerie, and knowing that probably we had friends who would lose parents, and just it was it wasn't like I was really young. I was very old enough and aware of what was going on, and just remember how unusual and strange and silent and weird that day was. And I didn't fully appreciate it until I met people from other states when I went to college at Rutgers the following year, and there'd be people from Kentucky and Alabama and Virginia and California who, to them it was a news event that happened across across the other end of the country. And to us, it was real with people we knew. And my father, who was a radio broadcaster, he went to work and didn't come home for a few nights because he and his colleagues had to cover this. But when he came, I remember when he came home for the first time, he took us back in the car and drove us up the turnpike after the turnpike reopened to see how it was still smoldering days later. And I remember he wanted us to remember how important and solemn this day was. So, it's strange. It's so strange to think it's 24 years later. I've obviously graduated high school, college, worked at the Star Ledger for more than a decade, gotten married, had 2 kids. And now my wife, who's a 4th grade teacher, is teaching these to students who it's like Pearl Harbor. It's like a history event to them. So it's weird, the transition of time, but remembering how eerie that day was.
Well, what are you going to? I think you're going to face a challenge that you're well up to because you're a terrific father. But how do you feel? You're going to have to explain that event to your children, just like you mentioned Pearl Harbor. My dad had to explain to me Pearl Harbor, and my mother had been affected by Pearl Harbor too. She was in Squirrel Hill, Pittsburgh that day, December 7, 1941. I was in Israel on, let's see, Monday. Tuesday was 9/11. And we made a special arrangement with one of the members of the Fisher family, a very influential family from Michigan in the Republican Party. And they arranged for us to get a flight home. But you mentioned the smoldering. I'll never forget flying, and then taking the bridge from. We were the only plane coming into Kennedy Airport. And when we were driving home, you could still see the smoldering. And when I got home, I watched a replay of President Bush when he said, "I can hear you." And that was, I'll never forget that. He really, two people I think really in the political realm rose to magnificent leadership during that time. One was President Bush, who really rallied the country behind him. And then the next week, talking about baseball, he went and he threw out the first ball at Yankee Stadium in a game. And that was really a signal to return to normalcy. The other was a man we had on, along with his daughter in the last podcast, Don DeFrancesco, and his daughter Tracy. And Don knew that he was leaving the governorship. He didn't run for re-election. And he really exhibited a lot of energy, a lot of intention to really keep the state together, keep the state running. And he doesn't, in my view, get enough credit for what he did during that period of time. It was a very bravura performance on his part. So those two political leaders, I think, acquitted themselves very well during an absolutely harrowing time. Brent, you hadn't started yet with, you were still in high school. So
yeah, I was senior in high school. Yep. It's strange to think about. And I actually had an interview not that long ago with Tom Kane, Sr.,
sure,
who obviously is so tied to the 9/11 Commission. And it's interesting talking about this like an historical event now. It really is for all of us who lived through it. It's odd. It feels weird, but those memories of that day never go away.
I don't think they're ever going to go away. I don't think they will. So we've had perspectives. I was living up in West Orange, but I was working at that time I was the executive director of the Meadowlands Commission. And I called my office when I got the news in Israel about 9/11. And I was told that my entire staff had gone into my office and they were watching the World Trade Center collapse. And that just the thought of that was eerie to me. And when I came back, I had a number of people who had been emotionally shaken by the events. And I had to go around and give comfort to people. But no one did the job that Lou Eisenberg, who was then the head of the Port Authority, did when he really, as he said, he walked among heroes. He walked among the Port Authority police. He walked among the firemen who had risked their lives, and some of them had given their lives. He walked among all these people, and to me, Lou will always be my hero of 9/11. This is an example of a person who had been in private life, and he had decided to give a few years for public service. I feel fortunate. He's a mentor to me, and I will always feel fortunate to have known him. I still keep in contact with him. And that was the time for people to step forward. So on that note, we'll go to the next topic, which is another harrowing topic. The topic is the assassination of Charlie Kirk. I'll keep my remarks limited because I know there's a lot of emotion on this. I had profound disagreement with Charlie Kirk, and I wrote about this on social media today. I wrote about this on Facebook, and I said I had two big problems with him. One was his opposition to the Civil Rights Acts of the 60s, and the other was that he had really blasted Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He was a hero of mine. But nevertheless, I felt that he served a good function. He basically had gotten a lot of people into politics. And when you get into politics, I think it has a moderating effect. So I don't think that necessarily that his views certainly influenced those that he came in contact with. But at least these people got exposure to the political arena the first time. I'd like to I'd like to call upon Doc at this point because he taught about this in his class today. Tell us a little bit about it.
So this year I'm actually doing social studies classes. So it's been very prevalent especially in a U.S. History 2 class, which benefits that anything qualifies as U.S. History 2 because it goes to present for a little bit of humor on a rough day. So my co-teacher and I started talking about, we talked about first discussing is how do you have disagreements without being disagreeable? And how do we get to a point where you could be passionate? And passion is good, but when passion turns to hysteria and turns to irrational decisions, what do you do? How do you control things back in that? How do we avoid these emotional, especially with, I'm like, you're inundated with social media. It's very easily become radicalized and think there's only one way out. And we started also comparing it to actually the school shooting. In addition to that, simultaneously, which I don't think could be any more of an American event than having two type of shooting events in the same day. And we talked about that myself is I am not a huge fan of Charlie Kirk, but I have a tremendous amount of respect. As someone who's a lifelong passionate person for civic engagement, anybody who can get people involved and be able to have conversation, get them interested, realizing the world is bigger than they are, is almost as a hero to mine, but someone who I have to have a tremendous amount of respect for. Because for so often, this generation was ignored and marginalized. Like, oh, they're not going to show up. But for him to go out and say, no, if we get them to show up, we could have a huge turn in the ballot box. And he really motivated, and it created a comfort place for people. And I also appreciate anyone who's willing to debate the issues and talk to people who disagree with them deserves credit. That in itself is mildly courageous in a way. And then he always made space for them at the event, and he knew he was polarizing. And I think the fact that he owned that, and the fact that he went on Governor Newsom's podcast and things like that, he had an element of approachability that was unique. And I feel awful for his wife and being a parent. I can't even imagine that.
I agree.
And that I think you have to treat it as the person versus the figure in a way. That you have your public persona, the big gravitas, but at the same point, he goes home and he's dad.
Well, Doc, I think you're showing a very good perspective on this. I'm going to get to Brent next on this, but I want to ask you one thing, and that is, no one ever I'm a generation, actually almost two generations older than both of you, and I never dreamed when I was a kid that going to school would be an experience that could cost you your life. I had a friend who was down in, I think it was in Parkland, Florida, where they had the shooting within the school. Yeah. And his son was there, and I called him that day because I heard where it was, and I was frightened for him. He was calmer than I was. He said his son was in the closet the whole time, and he avoided the shooting. I mean, I would have just been terrified by something like that. His son was in the closet. His son called him from the closet. But it was a hell of an experience. But again, it's the type of situation now where just going to school can be a threat to your life. This has to stop. This has to stop. It's not tolerable. I don't have an answer. I can say all the things about we need to respect each other, and that's all true. And how we need to have a dialogue where we can disagree without being disagreeable. But I think nowadays, both students and outside agitators have a belief that they have a license to commit violence to basically impose their political views. We don't know yet what the complete motivation was of the assassin, but I'm going to be very interested in finding out. Doc, any comment on that? And then I'll go over.
No, I agree with you. I mean, I was in fifth grade. I was in fifth grade when Columbine happened. I can literally repeat each of the times. And I mean, MSU's one was probably the closest one. My brother and sister-in-law in Michigan, my sister-in-law taught in that building where it was done. Had it been that time, she would have been teaching. It had it been the next day when that shooting took place. And that it's just, we are in error of, we had, when you guys went out, when you were still, you were hiding in your decks because of the Cold War. We now have hiding down in lockdown, shelter in place. These are normal terms for us. And it was jarring when my kids were coming home and talking about this in elementary school, even preschool, and being.
Do your kids have drills at school?
Oh yeah, they're mandated by law.
What about you, Brent? The students in your wife's school have drills?
Yeah, they do. They have to be. She's fully trained on all that, and it's funny. My father always talked about how I would mention when I started covering when I got more involved in covering politics over the last decade about how divided I would see. I would go to political events and see how divided we were as a country. And my dad would say, well, you didn't live through the Vietnam War and the political violence of the 60s, the death of Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy. And, there weren't air raid drills because of fear of communism. And now we're, getting back to that. It's different things. It's not air raid drills, but it's hiding in closets and doing drills about school shooters. It's political assassinations happening. And the one thing I saw, Jeff Pearlman, who the famous sports writer, had a video on TikTok talking today, where he was saying that whether he didn't agree with Charlie Kirk at all, but you don't want to see anyone die. Like nobody
wants that unless they're just
you don't want to see anyone get shot. And we're at this point where we now have to make sense of this and reason with it, because someone in the public sphere gets killed on camera, and I don't like it. I don't like having to reckon with this at all. And I hope that no one ever gets comfortable with it, and I'm ever afraid that we're going to.
Well, what do you think, Brent, gives people the feeling that they have a license? This is a very simplistic question, but it's a question that never gets resolved. I went to school, the elementary school in the 50s, and in the 60s, I was in junior high school and high school. Then I went away to college. Now, the most violent time, well, first of all, the assassination of President Kennedy. I'm never going to forget that day. That is a day I was talking to my partner, Garnet, last week. Garnet, it's an amazing story. Garnet and I went to high school at the same time, and I was very smitten with her, but I was afraid to approach her. And I finally got together with her 50 years later by Facebook, and now we've been going together for 4 years. So that's the interesting Alan Steinberg social story. But we were both talking about our experiences on the day that President Kennedy was assassinated. And I'll never forget, we had, where I lived was in the suburb of Pittsburgh. It was a town that was very ethnic. It had a Jewish community that I was a member of. It was small, but it was very thriving. There are very few of these Jewish communities left in Western Pennsylvania. But it was very populated by Italians. Everyone got along. It was surprising. It was a suburb of Pittsburgh. We all got along, but the assassination of Kennedy changed a lot of the atmosphere at that time, because I remember I was in choir in the 6th period and I was going to the 7th period, and I saw girls crying in the hallway, and there was a lot of, all of a sudden the bells started ringing. And those bells meant that he had died. It was coming from St. Peter's Roman Catholic Church. That meant that Kennedy had passed away. And that whole weekend was an unreal. It didn't matter. Here's the difference between then and now. It didn't matter what your political views were, Democrat, Republican. You were angry because Kennedy was our president. He was the president of not only the Democrat or Republicans, he was our president. In those days, there was a certain respect given to the president that really superseded everything. And I went home, I went to synagogue that night. The whole weekend was like one gigantic national funeral, as well as the funeral you were seeing on TV. But that was kind of there's that song by, what's the guy's name? Don McLean, The Day the Music Died.
Bye. Yeah.
Bye, Miss America. That was the beginning of that. And that has lasted for almost 50 years. But back then, there was a feeling of nationally, we were one family. And unfortunately, ever since that day, it's gone away. But not only that, there's no shock value to the violence anymore. On April 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King was assassinated. On June 6th of that year, Bobby Kennedy died from an assassin's bullet. Assassinations and violence seem a part of our lives. And Brent, I can't put a finger on why that is.
We talk about this being 9/11, and that may have been the last time we as a country were united because it was like a communal tragedy that happened to all of us. But I wonder, it was before social media, it was before the internet. Really, that was considered the first major event that was covered on the internet. My father talks about using, AP on the online to cover it then. Social media politics has gotten much nastier. I feel like that was the last time, maybe the Iraq war was the dividing point where people started to take sides and get very angry about things. And I just feel like if 9/11 happened now, I don't know if the reaction would be as unified. I don't know. I mean, who knows? I hope we never ever have to experience anything remotely like that again. But it feels like a different atmosphere in the country now than it did 24 years ago.
It certainly does. And I remember another thing, and I'm not trying to be graphic. I don't know what it was. This is 52 years ago, 1963. When it was on my birthday, November 22nd. This was my 14th birthday.
Yes.
For some reason, I've really gotten caught up on this recently. I'm a historian wannabe, and I'm always reading history books. And the second volume of a book by Friedrich Lojebal, he's written the best biography of JFK. The second book is coming out this year, so I'm really looking forward to it because he wrote as a true biographer, not as a hagiographer. He gave you Kennedy warts and all, the good and the bad. And so I'm looking forward to this book. I don't know why. One night I watched the Zapruder film. And the reason I watched the Zapruder film is at that time, I just couldn't picture this young, vigorous JFK getting assassinated. I couldn't accept the news, even when I saw Jackie Kennedy get off the plane at the airport. But the Zapruder film came out about a year later, and there on the one hand, it was graphic, it was shocking, it was sickening. But on the other hand, the media does that, for better or for worse. It brings you these events, and for the first time, I could grasp what had happened. But not only that, the horror of it all finally hit me with the Zapruder film, and I've been watching it recently, and I just wonder what the hell has happened with our country.
Yeah. It's almost like, and social media, I think, which is in some ways a blessing because it teaches us things in real time and gives people a voice, but it also can amplify terrible things. And unfortunately we now watch all this stuff happen in real time. So I don't know. Politics feels different even from when I started covering it in 2013. That it seems like a quaint period. 2013, it was the beginning of it was a different presidency, different governorship, different time in the world, and here's hoping to better times.
But even in your time, then we'll get on to the news that is near and dear to us, the New Jersey election. Even in your time, since you started with the media, social media has really changed the game.
Yes,
it really has. One thing I like about social media is it gives me access to a lot of information. I don't have to, all the newspapers, periodicals, magazines. Now, I may have to pay some for that, but I don't mind. But you have so much. You're drowning in information. Now, on the one hand, that makes you well informed. On the other hand, you don't know where to get started.
Yeah.
Right?
Go ahead.
No, I think it goes back to critical thinking in a way, and I think that's part of the challenge. Especially if you look at my generation and the generation coming up, is with information overload, you need to understand what is accurate information, what is salacious. Like in the term media, you had the man biting dog or dog biting man. I grew up when I was learning about journalism world. We learned about shattered glass and the whole Stephen Glass situation and how that was the original fake news in a way.
Yeah.
But this new generation isn't being taught that, isn't learning to ingrain that and find out between fact and fiction. And with social media, you're able to live in a vacuum. And I think we saw the extreme of that during the pandemic. To going back, that is when you were locked in, you could focus just on what you wanted to hear. And when you don't get to hear the other viewpoint in a civil manner, that's when everything, to go back to everything, it all comes together to the extremism.
It does accelerate the conflict. And all we can do is pray for better days. That's all we can do. There's only, none of us by ourselves have the capability or the power to do that. But now it's back to the state that we love, New Jersey. This is turning into a primary. On the one hand, I like competitive primaries. This one's getting a little nasty and a little vicious. But I want to talk about what I think has been the It started off this week with the controversy between Jack Ciattarelli, and I make no secret I've endorsed Jack Ciattarelli. The controversy about his remarks regarding the, basically what he had said. I resented the fact he never really made a promise or commitment that he was going to eliminate the income tax and raise the sales tax. He was talking about hypotheticals, and I've defended him on that. But at the same time, that set a tone for the whole week. It set a blistering tone. But to me, the big news of the week ended up today with the publication of the national research poll. The poll was headed by Adam Geller. To me, I'm biased, I admit it. Adam Geller is the best pollster that we have in New Jersey. He does a terrific job, and he explains everything. And what his poll showed was the race is down to a 2-point race with a margin of error of 4. But I'll get to you for your reaction in a second, Brent. But what really struck me in that poll was that it showed that the public seems to be getting more unhappy and dissatisfied and wanting change the longer the election campaign proceeds. The other thing is it said that in spite of the fact that Mikey Sherrill, who's made a huge media buy, the Democrat Governors Association is really giving her a lot of additional help. She basically dominated the media the whole week. That commercial of hers on the helicopter seems to be on every few minutes. But it didn't seem to change the results very much. And I know that this has given the Ciattarelli campaign a lot of hope. Brent, what is your perspective both on the poll and in terms of where this race stands? We've now passed the Labor Day opening day.
This is it's the most fascinating governor's race of the 4 I've covered, just having an open seat, having, the dynamic of Ciattarelli running last time, replacing Murphy, Donald Trump hanging over all of it. And it's tough to gauge. I hear questions about, there might be voter apathy and who knows how many people are going to turn out. So the race is really a toss up. And that does seem to be the case. And it seems all polls show, even public polls from universities show a single digit race. And, we only have 2 months left. So it seems to be it's narrowing and that it really is anybody's game. And Ciattarelli, we're a state that's when we started this general election, I had a lot of friends and family who don't really follow politics come up to me. And I wrote about this in today's newsletter. Well, Mikey Sherrill's the favorite, right? They'd be like, it's a blue state. Trump's in the White House. Of course she's going to win. And I said, well, she's the favorite on paper, if you're looking at the early polls, but there's a lot of time left. And Ciattarelli proved last time that, he can really cut down on margins as they get closer to election day. So I'm really fascinated. It's going to be a tough one to predict, and it's going to be one to watch because I think this may be this close right down to the wire.
I agree with you 100%. And every day there seems to be some new trend that can affect things. I have this perspective based on pollsters and pundits I've talked to. This race seems to come down to 3 things. Turnout in Newark, turnout in Patterson, and then how many Democrat votes can Jack Ciattarelli garner? Because he is at a disadvantage in terms of voter registration, although the Republicans seem to be narrowing that gap. They've registered more new voters than the Democrats have, but they certainly are not able to close that gap. But I think those are the 3 aspects I'm looking at. What do you think of this perspective? You can be critical of it. I don't mind. I usually learn from you.
Yeah, no, there definitely seems to be enthusiasm on the Republican side. You see that registration, they're cutting into the numbers. And again, Democrats still outnumber Republicans by about 8,000 voters here, which is a big advantage. But independents are the second largest voting bloc, unaffiliateds. And the thought is if Jack can peel away enough independents and soft Democrats, that he could really make a run at it. It's again, we've had Republican governors numerous times in the last 40 years. We tend to go back and forth between parties. The last time that we had one party elected 3 times in a row was 1961 which was 3 years before the Beatles were on Ed Sullivan and a year before our beloved New York Mets even existed. So that's a long time ago. So, it's interesting because I do think there is a momentum, enthusiasm side on the Republican side, but is it enough to overcome that big gap of numbers? And his people seem really confident that they can peel away those and get maybe Democrats to stay home, which is something we saw with Kamala Harris last year. And the Democrats are really hoping, one, that that Trump is really going to maybe suppress the Republican vote, and maybe you have some people who aren't Trump fans or Republicans who don't want to support Jack, or the independent vote, that unaffiliateds won't go to Jack because they don't like Donald Trump. But these are things we won't know until Election Day.
Well, Jack has had a good argument on that. I think it's the most persuasive argument when he says, "Look, Donald Trump is not responsible for our property taxes. He's not responsible for our fuel costs. He's not responsible for our transportation issues." And I think to the extent that he can get the voters to totally focus on this as a New Jersey election rather than a national election, I think that will increase his chances.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, his evolution on Trump has kind of been like a lot of the party's evolution on Trump. Obviously, when Trump first came out, everyone from Rick Perry to Lindsey Graham was calling him, a charlatan and a carnival barker. And you started seeing them toe the line a little bit more in the land, and as years went on, and now the party has so embraced Donald Trump that it almost was a way that Jack couldn't ignore it, and that he also can't risk losing Republicans, and he needs, because you have to start, if you have to bowl 300 if you just start, if you're a Republican wanting to win a blue state, you can't lose any of the party. So he was in a tough place, and again, the question is, are people going to walk into the voting booth? They say all politics is local, but really it's become more national. And that's what Democrats are hoping. People are going to go into the voting booth and go, I can't support a Republican. But maybe it's the same way around. You see Jack talking about, we've had 8 years of Democratic rule and Phil Murphy in charge. Maybe they're just tired and there's Murphy fatigue and it's time to go to the other side. So again, like I said, as fascinating as any race I've ever covered.
Well, I think that Jack has the best issue in terms of potential to affect the election. And that issue is the cost of utility bills. That is, he made a point with me. I communicate often with him. He said everywhere he went the past weekend, he was asked one question: what are you going to do about utility bills? And here he seems to be gaining an advantage because there have been, Mikey has not gotten great press on her plan to freeze the cost. There's been a number of articles that explain that that's not feasible because the cost of your utility bill includes a lot of aspects. It includes what PJM may charge. It includes new suppliers coming online. It's very difficult to administer a freeze. I don't like freezes because I think it's bad economics. But people are entitled to different economic perspectives. But I think that that's the issue that he has to talk about and talk and talk and talk in order to get a really compelling message. And this is something that in his two previous races, he did well, but he didn't have an issue like this. And I think that this could be his silver bullet.
Yeah, that does seem to be, because it's an issue that people see. You physically get a bill or you see it online and whoa, that went up by X amount of money. So it hits, it's the whole kitchen table pocketbook issues. It hits you directly. So you may not pay attention to abortion or even much the economy or transit, but everyone knows they have to pay a utility bill and they have to pay a tax bill. And that's why those things tend to rule here, because we're such a high cost state.
Absolutely. And I remember one election, this is way in my youth, 1966. I was growing up in the Pittsburgh area, and Bill Scranton had been the governor of Pennsylvania. He was very popular. He couldn't run for re-election then because in Pennsylvania, the law then was you couldn't succeed yourself. You were term limited, not actually, well, you were term limited to one term. You could wait 4 years and then you could run again. But he could not succeed himself. And so his lieutenant governor, Ray Schaefer, was running. and he was running against Milton Schaap, who was a phenomenally successful cable television entrepreneur. He was really the first successful cable television entrepreneur in the country. Now, Milton Schaap grabbed a hold of what was then the public utility issue, and it wasn't that different from what it was now, except these costs are really exorbitant now. But they were going up, and he seized upon that issue, but it wasn't enough to win the election. Now, I'm not going to make a prediction as to whether the utility cost issue is going to be enough for Jack to win. I think it could. But I do think that this is the first election I've seen where utility bills could be the major issue and the decisive issue.
Yeah, I think I wrote about this actually right before I went on vacation, as we were getting closer to Labor Day. That I had a Democratic operative tell me this is the issue. This is the one you really have to watch.
I always read your columns, and I read that.
And I remember, and so it was right after then that she had her plan to freeze, and which was an attempt to break from Murphy. And I actually heard that Murphy wasn't very happy about that. He publicly said, "I don't know if this is going to work," and that they had a meeting and it didn't go very well, and he wasn't very happy that she didn't let him know. This is from all the insiders who talked to me. So, it's going to be the defining issue, I think so. Because everybody knows about it. It's something that most people in the state, and it might give people a reason to vote.
Well, it's certainly the Chitterelli campaign hopes so, and I think they've done a good job of making it the focus. They've gone on TV, but not nearly as much as the Mikey Sherrill campaign. It'll be interesting as to when they go on television. They have money. They're not hurting for money. They don't have the money that the Democrats have. And someone said to me today, "Oh, RGA doesn't seem to be too confident about it. Republican Government Association doesn't seem to be too confident." I said, that doesn't bother Jack at all, because they gave him no help whatsoever, no help and no hope in the gubernatorial race of 2021. As a matter of fact, the word was that Chris Christie, who is not the easiest person to deal with in the world, he had been out of office for 4 years. And he went to RGA and he basically said, "No, I don't think that Jack Chitterelli can win," which I don't think has endeared him very much to Jack Chitterelli. But I don't think that, it certainly is a help to Mikey Sherrill to have that much money. But I think in a political race, it's not really so much how much money you have. The question is, do you have enough money, even if your opponent has more, to get your message across? I think it's more that than who has the most money.
Yeah, I mean, because it's all about when you're watching TV and you see how many ads roll across the screen, or if you sign into social media, how many ads go across your screen. Because again, most people don't pay as much attention to this stuff as we do, and the listeners of this podcast and the readers of my newsletter, they're the ones who really want to learn all the nooks and crannies and stuff. But most people see what they see on ads or what they may catch on online, and if you have money, you can get that across more. Especially, it's also an expensive state to do business politically, because we don't have a broad television spectrum. You have to advertise in New York and Pennsylvania and Philadelphia, and that's expensive.
Well, I think that you have put your finger right on it, because New Jersey, you have to go on network television to really get your message across.
Yeah.
And if you're going on network television in either New York or Philadelphia, you are going to pay a lot of shekels for that. Yeah. Now, I will tell you, the experience I had that really brought it home. Some people love George Norcross, some people hate him, but you got to give him credit for this. He brought New Jersey politics into the modern television era.
Yes.
And he did this, and this is where you and I are going to get baseball into this discussion.
Mm-hmm.
Back in the races of 1991, Florio was very unpopular. It was the off-year elections.
Yeah.
He was very unpopular, and it was evident that the Republicans would capture both the Assembly and Senate. The question was whether they would get veto-proof majorities. And they did. And that was the big news that year. That was the most exciting legislative elections I've ever experienced. But I'll tell you when it really came to a head. Lee Laskin had been the state senator down in the 6th District in Camden County. And he basically had run a very intense race every time he won. He was pretty popular. And he would win in elections that the Democrats might win the assembly seats. But by the time 91 came around, he had served a few terms as state senator. And John Rocco, who was my dear friend, who basically got me involved in Trenton politics, John Rocco and Lee Solomon, who later became a Supreme Court justice, everyone thought that they would be shoo-ins. Now, Rocco and Solomon did get reelected fairly easily. But Laskin became a target of Norcross. And it was very personal because Laskin had used, he just passed away this past year. Laskin had used senatorial courtesy to block the appointment of George Norcross's father to the racing commission. And I don't blame George. He was very upset. And he said, I'm going to get even. So for the first time, George has been the most, and I don't say this in a bad way at all, George is the best fundraiser / chair you're ever going to see in your life. Of course, now it's a subject of some legal controversy. I can't judge that, but George is a phenomenal fundraiser. And John Adler, the late John Adler, who was a friend of mine, rest his soul, John was running to challenge Laskin in that senatorial election, 1991. And most people thought that Laskin would survive. But George raised enough money for John Adler to go on network television. And they waited until the very end. They waited, I'll give you the exact, not the exact numerical date, but the exact timing. The Minnesota Twins were in the World Series that year against the Atlanta Braves. It was a great World Series, by the way. The Twins won in 7 games.
I remember that, yep.
After the 6th game, the game was over. I still remember Jack Buck, Kirby Puckett hit a home run. And Jack Buck goes, there's a long fly ball, and we'll see you tomorrow night.
Yep.
That was one of the most exciting World Series games I ever saw. So they went off the field the next night. It ended up, I think it was 1-0 was the final score. That was a great World Series. But that commercial, because of the timing, right after he said, we'll see you tomorrow night, before the news came on, they always schedule election commercials around the time that the news comes on because your likely voters, a lot of them, a good percentage, in fact, maybe most of them, watch the news. So Saturday night, the World Series is over. The news in Philadelphia is about to come on. And the first thing the viewers see is a negative commercial that George Norcross had enabled John Adler to run. And that negative commercial blasted Laskin for the municipal sponsorships he had. Laskin was an honorable guy, but it made Laskin sound like Boss Tweet. It was a great, effective commercial. And that was the beginning of the end for Laskin. He hadn't planned for anything like this. But they ran this commercial every single night. And John Adler was elected. He was the only Democrat in that election to unseat a Republican. You talk about excitement, Brent. That was really, you would have loved that election. It was really something. So that changed the ball game in New Jersey. It changed the ball game because all of a sudden everybody had to go on. The next election, 93, legislative election, everybody was going on network TV, and that skyrocketed the cost of elections, and it had a spillover effect into the gubernatorial race between Florio and Whitman because television became the way, network television became the way that you had to really have the wherewithal to win. Now, this time, Cheryl has a lot of money, and, she's out there early. But that was the big news. That was the big news as far as I was concerned about Adam Geller's poll on behalf of Jack Ciattarelli, is it showed that even though she was dominant all week in terms of network presence, according to this poll, she didn't gain at all in terms of, didn't make the race any closer. And the other factor, now, I see you're grinning because I have a feeling you don't fully believe that. Okay.
No, I again, I was actually.
I'm not saying that negatively to you either.
No, I understand. It's funny. I was talking yesterday to some colleagues, and I said, this race is really. I said this earlier. It's really tough to predict because there's so many different factors, and it's an open seat. We've never had a president like Trump before. Murphy, it's 8 years of Murphy. Usually we go back to the other party. It's just, and there's a lot of voter apathy in politics. I think people are tired of how tough and nasty politics have gotten, and there's a threat that maybe it'll be a tall task to get some voters out. So, and polling's been volatile. We all polling hasn't always been right in recent years, and I remember talking to my now late colleague Matt Arco at the end of the 2021 race, and we, on the final weekend of the campaign, they sent him to a Chitterelli event and me to a Murphy event. And I remember we gathered to write our story that Sunday night, and Matt was like, "I'm telling you, Brent," he's like, the momentum was on Chitterelli's side, even though the polls had showed Murphy was up. And I remember being like, "Huh, I guess you're right." I said I didn't feel the same at Murphy, and lo and behold, Chitterelli came within 3 points of defeating him, even though no polls had showed it was that close.
And I didn't think he had a chance in that election.
Yeah. So who who knows this time if they'll be the same? I know that the polls are closer now than they were at this point in 2021.
Yes, and the other factor is Trump is very unpopular, and I think that that doesn't have a particular effect on Chitterelli, but it does affect his ability to get Democratic votes to switch over and vote for the Republican candidate. I think he can overcome that, but that's something that puts a burden on him. That's where the Trump factor comes in. But up until now, the fact that the Republicans have felt that, because of the alleged unpopularity of Murphy, and I don't think he's particularly popular, but I talked to Dan Casino, who is also a very expert pollster. Mm-hmm. Dan said to me that Murphy's popularity has been roughly about 48% the whole time. It never varies.
After the initial wave of COVID, when he was high, just like Christie was after Sandy, yeah, it's pretty much leveled out. He has been in the 40s. It's pretty much been the case for the second term.
But here is where I think will be the telling factor one way or other. And that is, even though his popularity has not varied, the people who are dissatisfied, who are unhappy with government, who feels that the state is in the wrong track, that has gone up. And while the voters are not saying in particular that, hey, Murphy is a bad guy, we got to get rid of him. They're not saying that. But in the recent polls, and this is giving the Republicans a lot of encouragement, it does show that they want to change. And as such, that is something that can help Jack a great deal. That if it's not particularly an anti-Murphy factor, it is a change factor. And I think that you will see down the stretch, he will be talking change all the time. And he will be talking utility bills all the time, because those utility bills make the state more unaffordable. And so I can almost anticipate what his message will be. And that will be the deciding factor in the election.
Yeah, it's I think that the change factor is definitely, again, yeah, Murphy is not an incredibly unpopular guy, but there's enough sentiment against him to boost Republicans, and it's the same. It's considered a proxy battle. This may be a proxy war between, are you fed up with 8 years of Phil Murphy, and again, not an incredibly unpopular guy, but is that enough to push the Republicans over, or is it going to be, are you doing a protest vote against Donald Trump through the governor's race?
I'm wondering about one other thing, and that is exactly when are the checks going to go out, for example, for the Anchor program and some of these others?
2 years ago, it went out before Election Day. I'm not 100% certain. That's a good question. That was Republicans accused Democrats last legislative elections of.
Well, I hear you, and you're correct. But the other factor is, when Brendan Byrne was running for re-election, he was a big underdog back in '77 against Ray Bateman. And they asked Ray Bateman, when did you know you had lost? He said, when I got a check, and it was only $200. Now the Anchor program, you can get $700 out of it.
Yeah.
But $200. He said, I saw the signature of Brendan Byrne, and I knew that was going to assuage the concerns of a lot of anti-tax people who wanted to vote against Brendan Byrne because of the income tax. But all of a sudden, when they were getting a check back, they saw some merit to it.
Yeah, it's a good campaign ploy if you can have something like that. And that's the benefits of incumbency, that the Democrats do have, having 20 years in control of the legislature. But, yeah, that's a good thing. That's a really good question. I actually should look into that when those checks go out.
Yes, I'll be calling you on that.
Yeah.
Because that is something that we don't know. And I'll tell you the other interesting historical factor. There's always been a debate. Should you just lower the taxes and the state taxes, in which case the public is not that inflamed against you, or should you do it by way of rebates? Get more money and then send it back. It's not great economics.
No.
It doesn't make sense for people to send you money and then you send it back. However, there's a political impact, and that is that people are really appreciative. They don't stop and think, hey, that's my money I'm getting back. They think they're getting some kind of bonus, some kind of gift. And when those checks come back, that can affect a lot of elections. Whether it'll affect this year or not, I don't know. But the affordability issue consists of several components. One is housing costs, and they really haven't talked that much about housing in this election. I thought they would talk about it more.
Heard about it more in the primary, actually. It was a really big
Yes.
topic in the primary. You're not hearing as much in the general.
And the second is, income taxes and property taxes. You're getting some of that, but no one is coming out with that much specific. But the third are these utility bills.
Yes.
Now, that's the thing that the voters are aware of. That is the best chance that Jack Ciattarelli has, and that's why I think he will be pushing it. He told me, he said everywhere he goes, they're asking him about that, and I think if they continue to, his chances of defeating Mike Sherrill go up considerably.
Yeah. I think that pocketbook issues are becoming, you're hearing her talk less about Trump, him actually talk a little bit less about Murphy, but because they're trying to hit people where they are with the pocketbook kitchen table issues. And I think that's, as it's always been the case in New Jersey, but even with Trump, even with Murphy, I still think it's going to boil down to that in the end.
I think so too, and I think the voters are going to compare the two, and that is going to be the decisive factor. But I'll be interested in finding out from you, number one, when the checks are coming out.
Yeah,
I'm checking. I'm trying to find out exactly what the plans will be in terms of when Ciattarelli is going to go out there and really start paying for commercials on the air. He's not. He has the money to do a good buy. He's done well fundraising, but he's holding his powder, and I think that's a wise strategy. But you and I are going to have a lot of interesting journalism over the next few weeks.
Yes, absolutely. It's going to be a fascinating stretch the next few weeks, and it always is. But like I said, at the risk of repeating myself, this is a really fascinating race. It'll lock and change, and it's going to be an election night to watch.
Well, I got to tell you, Brent, it's always a pleasure to have you on. Number one, you make an excellent presentation. You're a media savvy guy, and you have a lot of insight since you are a lifelong New Jerseyan.
Yes, I am. I love this state.
Jack has made a point that he is the real Jersey guy. I think that point has more salience than I ever thought, because he was making fun of the way Phil Murphy ate pizza 4 years ago. I said, what the hell's he doing now? But that had a point. He was the Jersey guy, and Mikey is the Virginia person. So I think he has always maneuvered that issue very carefully and very smartly.
It's a state with a lot of pride, and because we often get kicked around by a lot of other states people. So we can make fun of us, but no one else can make fun of us. But it is interesting to that point. I will note that the last three Democratic, the last two, and she would be the third, have hailed from out of state. John Corzine was from Illinois, and Phil Murphy from Massachusetts. Yes. So there is a Democratic precedent of outsiders coming. Even Jim Florio is from Brooklyn.
But you know what Jim Florio used to tell me? He and I became very close friends towards the end of his life, and we would have lunch. He would love to talk history with me, but Jim Florio always said, Alan, because I have regretted for years the decline of Camden. It was a great city at one time. It was a fantastic city. And in fact, in the Jewish community, the wealthy Jews lived in Camden. That's hard for people to believe. Well, my aunt and uncle, with whom I was very close, they moved. He was the head of the commissary at Fort Dix. he moved to what was then Delaware Township. Today is Cherry Hill. And he moved there, and his family moved there. They were like the equivalent, and they bought what they called prefabricated housing. And they settled in Cherry Hill. And then in the race riots of 1966 or 67, that's when white middle class voters really started moving out of Camden en masse. They moved either to Cherry Hill or to Turnersville in Gloucester County. That was what I call the Great Migration. That was a historic event politically as well as demographically.
And similar things happened in Newark too at that time. Yeah.
Yeah, well, the riots happened in Newark, and they moved to places like West Orange. And next time you're on, I want to talk about Newark because something's going on there. I do not know. I don't know how involved Barack is going to be in getting out the vote, but they're going to need him. They're going to need a happy Baraka. And I've heard a few rumors, and I'll be in more of a position to substantiate them and discuss it with you on the air. Hey, Brent, it's always terrific when you come on.
Oh, my pleasure.
We love having you on the show, and you add something on journalistically, artistically, and we can console each other on the imminent demise of the Mets this year. And say, as they used to say in Brooklyn, and this is the 70th anniversary of the only World Series the Brooklyn Dodgers ever won. We can say it this time, wait till next year. Brent, thank you so much. And again, you're a credit to New Jersey journalism.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you, Doc. Happy to be here.
That's it for this show. I thank our producer, was and is, Yoni Aries. Again, our special guest, Brent Johnson. And I'm Alan Steinberg, the voice of Dynamic Political Centrism, saying, may we all live in better times, and may there be much more hope for the future for ourselves, for our parents, and for our grandchildren. That's it for tonight's podcast. Stay warm, stay well.
Thank you for joining us for the latest edition of Dynamic Political Centrism. Check back each week for our newest episodes, and you can catch past episodes online via YouTube and Spotify, and please subscribe to our Substack.